unbroken history of the man behind the mask. Before we begin our journey, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a gentle fog. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to know that the same story is weaving through different corners of the world, one quiet night at a time. Now, let's begin our descent into the complete lore of Michael Myers. In the peaceful suburban streets of Haddonfield, Illinois, on a crisp autumn day in 1957, Michael Audrey Myers entered the world as the second child of Edith and Peter Myers. His older sister, Judith, had already been part of the family for 9 years, creating a household dynamic where the significant age gap often left young Michael occupying his own separate sphere of existence. From his very earliest days, even as a toddler taking his first steps and speaking his first words, there seemed to be something fundamentally different about the boy. He rarely engaged with the colorful toys that other children his age found captivating, showed little interest in the games and activities that typically absorbed young minds, and maintained an emotional distance that neighbors and family friends found quietly unsettling, though they couldn't quite articulate why. This subtle withdrawal from the normal rhythms of childhood didn't manifest as aggression or obvious disturbance, but rather as a profound stillness, an inward focus that made the young boy seem almost absent even when physically present in a room. As a result of this unusual demeanor, adults in the community extended small gestures of kindness, hoping to draw Michael into the warmth of neighborhood life. These well-meaning efforts, however, consistently fell short of bridging the invisible gap that seemed to surround the child like a force field of detachment. Though the film canon provides limited specific details about Michael's early social interactions, we know that neighbors occasionally made attempts to engage him with other children his age, suggesting informal play dates and gatherings at the Myers home during afternoon hours when the sunlight streamed through kitchen windows and cast long shadows across hardwood floors. Yet during these carefully orchestrated social opportunities, Michael would invariably drift away from whatever shared activity the adults had arranged, positioning himself instead near a window where he would stand for hours, gazing outward at the street beyond, his small face expressionless, his thoughts utterly unknowable to those who watched him with growing concern. This pattern of behavior, while not overtly disruptive or violent, stemmed from an inner landscape that remained completely inaccessible to parents, teachers, and neighbors alike. The cause of Michael's profound detachment was never discussed within the family structure, fostering a home environment where his quiet, observant nature was simply accepted as an inherent part of who he was, without deeper inquiry into its psychological roots or potential future consequences. By the time Michael reached 6 years of age, no clear warning signs had emerged that would alarm his parents or prompt intervention from concerned community members, allowing him to be perceived as merely an unusually quiet child rather than one harboring something far darker beneath the surface of ordinary suburban life. Despite his emotionally distant demeanor and tendency toward isolation, Michael navigated the basic routines of daily existence with minimal outward difficulty. He attended school lessons without causing disruption, sat through family meals in silence, accompanied his parents on neighborhood walks through tree-lined streets where autumn leaves gathered in colorful drifts along the curbs. This unassuming presence allowed him to move through life largely unnoticed by the broader community, but it also generated unspoken pity from observant adults like Mrs. McCabe, a neighbor who sensed an underlying solitude in the child's quiet gaze and infrequent, mechanical smiles that never quite reached his eyes. As a consequence of this dynamic, Michael's early years unfolded in relative calm, with the peaceful surface of Haddonfield life remaining undisturbed. These formative years shaped a boy who observed the world far more than he participated in it, absorbing details and patterns while remaining fundamentally disconnected from the emotional bonds that typically anchor children to their families and communities. This pattern would continue, day after quiet day, season after season, until the events of one particular Halloween night would shatter that fragile normalcy forever, transforming a withdrawn child into something that would haunt Haddonfield for generations to come. As the autumn sun dipped below the horizon on October 31st, 1963, casting long purple shadows across the quiet streets of Haddonfield, a simple one-piece outfit with bold primary colors and a painted plastic face mask, moved through the shadows of the family home with an eerie purposefulness that, in retrospect, seems laden with terrible significance. While the film canon leaves his precise motivations ambiguous, never fully explaining what drove the events that would follow, we know that Michael caught glimpses through a doorway of his sister Judith and her boyfriend sharing intimate moments in the upstairs bedroom, their silhouettes visible through the partially open door as they moved together in the private world of teenage romance. This observation prompted something within the 6-year-old boy, some internal mechanism clicking into place that would forever alter the trajectory of his life and the lives of everyone in Haddonfield. He moved toward the kitchen with deliberate steps, his small hand reaching for the wooden block that held the family's collection of knives. His fingers closed around the handle of a large kitchen knife, its blade catching the dim light from the hallway as he gripped it tightly, feeling its weight, its potential. This decision escalated quietly in the stillness of the house, with no one aware of what was unfolding in the mind of the child in the clown costume. Michael then began his ascent up the stairs, moving without sound. Despite his small size, each step carrying him closer to an action that would define him for the rest of his existence. The decision had been made in whatever dark space existed behind his young eyes, setting in motion an irreversible chain of events that would forever alter his family's fragile peace and introduce something ancient and terrible into the ordinary world of suburban America. In Judith's bedroom, where posters of popular music groups hung on the walls and teenage belongings cluttered the dresser and desk, she sat at her vanity, running a brush through her long hair in the aftermath of her boyfriend's departure. The room was softly lit by a bedside lamp, creating an intimate atmosphere of teenage solitude. Michael approached from behind, his presence completely masked by the playful clown costume that rendered him almost innocent in silhouette. A small figure that should have belonged at a Halloween party rather than in this moment that would become the fulcrum of so much future horror. Without warning, without any verbal preamble or expression of anger, the 6-year-old raised the kitchen knife and drove it into his sister multiple times. The strikes were methodical rather than frenzied, delivered with an unnatural steadiness for a child so young, as though some other force guided his small arm through the terrible motions. Judith's cries faded quickly into the night, absorbed by the walls of the house and lost to the distant sounds of trick-or-treaters laughing on neighboring streets, their joy a stark contrast to the violence unfolding in the Myers home. The violence stemmed from an inner compulsion that completely overrode any natural childish hesitation or moral understanding, transforming what should have been a protective sibling space into a scene of irreversible loss that would echo through decades. As Judith slumped forward over the vanity, her life draining away, Michael stood for a moment in the aftermath, the knife still gripped in his small hand, before turning and retreating down the stairs with that same deliberate, unhurried pace. He stepped out onto the front lawn, emerging into the Halloween night where jack-o'-lanterns glowed on neighboring porches and paper ghosts swayed in the breeze from tree branches. Michael stood motionless under the amber glow of the street lamp, the bloody knife hanging loosely at his side, his clown mask reflecting the light in a way that rendered it simultaneously childish and profoundly disturbing. This calm demeanor in the face of such horror baffled those who later recounted the event, but it directly resulted in his parents' arrival moments later, pulling up in their car to discover the worst nightmare any parent could imagine. Edith and Peter Myers stepped out of their vehicle to find their daughter gone and their son frozen in place on the lawn, bloodied and unblinking, the knife glinting in his small hand. The immediate consequence of this discovery shattered the evening's normalcy completely, drawing neighbors from their homes and summoning authorities to the once ordinary house that would never be ordinary again. The murder's aftermath would linger in Haddonfield, like a scar on the town's collective psyche, casting a permanent shadow over what had been one of the most beloved holidays, ensuring that Halloween would never again feel entirely innocent in the years and decades to follow. While the primary canon does not provide extensive details about the immediate aftermath and the chaos of that terrible night, we know that by November 1st, 1963, young Michael had been placed into state custody for handling as a youth offender. Officials reviewed the crime scene with growing bewilderment, examining the evidence, and taking initial statements from neighbors and first responders, all of whom struggled to comprehend how a 6-year-old could have committed such a brutal act with such apparent detachment. The shocking nature of the crime, committed by someone so young, prompted authorities to take a procedural step that would define the rest of Michael's life, determining that he would undergo a full psychological evaluation to assess his mental state before any further legal proceedings could be considered. This decision arose from the unprecedented nature of the situation, leading to a shift from family life to institutional oversight that would span decades. As a result of these evaluations and the recommendations that followed, Michael was labeled as a case requiring specialized long-term care rather than punishment through the conventional juvenile justice system. His future was now tied to clinical reports and psychiatric assessments rather than the home routines and family bonds that anchored other children his age. The murder's aftermath continued to reverberate through Haddonfield, becoming the dark story that parents whispered about after children went to bed. The cautionary tale that made people lock their doors more carefully and watch their own children with heightened vigilance during the Halloween season. Following the psychological evaluation mandated by state custody officials who specialized in handling youth cases, Michael Audrey Myers was formally committed to psychiatric treatment rather than facing immediate criminal proceedings through the court system. Labeled as patient number A2201, he entered Smith's Grove Sanitarium, a sprawling mental health facility located in Warren County, Illinois, approximately 150 miles from his hometown. The institution had been designed specifically for the long-term care of individuals deemed unfit for trial, with its imposing brick buildings, manicured lawns, and chain-link fencing creating an environment that existed somewhere between hospital and prison. This decision arose directly from the evaluation's findings, which highlighted both Michael's young age and the inexplicable nature of the crime he had committed, prompting officials to prioritize psychiatric treatment over punishment, in the hopes that understanding and therapy might address whatever darkness dwelled within the child. As a consequence of this institutional placement, Michael's daily existence shifted dramatically from the familiar confines of his Haddonfield home to the structured routines of the sanitarium, where white walls, fluorescent lighting, and staff members in uniform scrubs created an environment designed to foster calm and stability in patients who might otherwise pose a danger to themselves or others. Dr. Samuel Loomis, a psychiatrist specializing in severe behavioral disorders and criminal psychology, was assigned to oversee Michael's case from the very beginning. Dr. Loomis began conducting regular sessions with the young patient, meeting with him in small, sterile consultation rooms where the air always smelled faintly of disinfectant and the windows were reinforced with wire mesh. The psychiatrist harbored initial hopes of uncovering the psychological roots of the violence that had erupted on that Halloween night, believing that patient examination and therapeutic intervention might reveal treatable causes behind Michael's actions and his disturbing lack of remorse or emotional response to what he had done. Over the initial 15 years at Smith's Grove Sanitarium from 1963 through 1978, Michael's presence remained largely undocumented in the film canon, reflecting a period of apparent stasis under Dr. Loomis's increasingly troubled, watchful eye. While the canon leaves facility protocols and daily routines somewhat ambiguous, we can infer that they included regular psychiatric oversight, controlled recreational activities in secured courtyards, educational programming appropriate for a developing child, and carefully monitored group interactions with other patients. The goal was to provide structure and stability while continuously assessing whether Michael posed an ongoing threat to society or might eventually be rehabilitated and reintegrated into the world beyond the sanitarium's gates. However, Michael's near catatonic state during these long years caused Dr. Loomis to grow increasingly alarmed rather than encouraged. Where other psychiatrists might have interpreted the patient's silence and stillness as progress or at least non-threatening passivity, Loomis perceived something far more disturbing lurking beneath the surface calm. This profound lack of outward behavior, the absence of any emotional response or human connection, led to what Loomis would later describe as a false sense of harmlessness among some staff members who interacted with Michael on a daily basis. Nurses and orderlies who escorted him to meals or supervised his brief periods of outdoor recreation found him compliant and quiet, posing no immediate behavioral problems that would require intervention or restraint. Yet this apparent docility directly fueled Dr. Loomis's growing conviction that an underlying evil persisted within Michael Myers, something fundamental and untreatable by any standard psychiatric method or therapeutic approach. As a result of these observations and his deepening certainty that Michael represented an unprecedented form of danger, the psychiatrist's reports to the court, which were delivered twice yearly as required by Michael's commitment order, evolved dramatically over time. What began as cautiously optimistic assessments gradually transformed into urgent warnings that emphasized the absolute necessity of continued isolation and the grave risks that would accompany any decision to release the patient into society. The sanitarium's calm facade, with its quiet hallways and structured daily schedules, masked this growing tension between Dr. Loomis's increasingly dire assessments and the administrative pressure to either demonstrate progress or consider alternative placements for long-term patients. This period of containment, stretching across Michael's childhood and teenage years, set the stage for what would become the central conflict of his eventual court-mandated reevaluation. The question that loomed over everything was deceptively simple yet profoundly complex. Was Michael Myers a damaged child who might be treated and eventually freed? Or was he something else entirely? Something that should never be allowed to walk among ordinary people again. By 1978, as Michael approached his 21st birthday, the legal framework that had governed his commitment since childhood reached a critical juncture. The court's original order mandated that he be brought before a judge for a comprehensive reevaluation and potential trial as an adult, a milestone that had been deferred pending his maturity and the outcome of psychiatric treatment over the intervening 15 years. This impending review stemmed from the initial sentencing structure, which had treated him as a juvenile offender whose future disposition would be determined once he reached legal adulthood and the full effects of institutional care could be properly assessed. Dr. Loomis, having spent those 15 years observing Michael's unchanging demeanor and becoming increasingly convinced of his patient's inherent dangerousness, advocated with passionate intensity against any possibility of release. In meetings with court officials, in written reports, and in testimony before review boards, Loomis insisted that Michael Myers represented a persistent and unique threat, despite the complete lack of violent incidents during his years of confinement. The consequence of this long-term commitment was a deepened mystery around Michael's psyche, with Loomis's insights shaping the facility's approach to his care while also creating an atmosphere of dread around the scheduled transfer that would take Michael back to Haddonfield for his adult hearing. Ultimately, this extended period of containment had preserved a fragile peace in Haddonfield, allowing the town to begin healing from the trauma of 1963 while Michael remained locked away in the distant sanitarium. But it also built inexorably toward the night when Michael's long silence would finally break, reminding the world of the unresolved shadows from that Halloween so many years before. The stage was set, the principal actors were in place, and the date on the calendar advanced steadily toward October 31st, 1978, when everything that had been carefully contained would come spilling out into the autumn darkness of Haddonfield streets once more. As Michael Audrey Myers turned 21 in October of 1978, the legal machinery that had been set in motion 15 years earlier required his physical transport from Smith's Grove Sanitarium back to Haddonfield for the mandated reevaluation hearing. Dr. Samuel Loomis, who had served as Michael's psychiatrist throughout his entire period of confinement, arrived at the facility on the evening of October 30th, accompanied by Nurse Marion Chambers, a colleague who had been assigned to assist in what everyone expected would be a routine, carefully controlled transfer under the institution's established security protocols. This journey back to Haddonfield stemmed directly from the original sentencing structure, which had deferred adult charges until Michael reached maturity, theoretically allowing time for psychiatric observation and treatment to provide a clear picture of whether he could safely rejoin society or required permanent institutionalization. The night was dark and heavy with the promise of rain, the kind of oppressive October weather that seems to press down on the landscape with physical weight. Dr. Loomis and Nurse Chambers expected to collect their patient, secure him in the transport vehicle according to strict procedures, and make the 150-mile drive back to Haddonfield without incident. However, as they approached Smith's Grove Sanitarium along the winding rural road that led to its gated entrance, something immediately struck them as wrong. The atmosphere felt disturbed, the usual orderly calm of the facility replaced by a sense of barely contained chaos. When they reached the main gates, they found them standing open, unattended, with no guard visible in the small security booth that normally controlled access. The gate mechanism had been left in the open position, its metal arms pointing skyward like an invitation rather than a barrier, and the grounds beyond were scattered with wandering figures. While the film canon leaves the specific details of the breakout somewhat ambiguous, we know that it occurred decisively on that rain-slicked October 30th evening. Multiple patients had somehow escaped from their secured wards into the facility grounds, creating a chaotic scene where the normal boundaries of control and confinement had completely dissolved. Patients wandered like spectral figures through the mist and light rain, some still in their hospital garments, others having shed them entirely, their presence overwhelming the immediate response capacity of the staff members who scrambled to regain order from the unfolding disaster. While the canon similarly leaves Michael's specific motivation ambiguous, his actions involved an unyielding, almost supernatural drive to return to Haddonfield, where unfinished echoes from 1963 continued to exert their pull across the years and miles. As a result of the facility's compromised security, Loomis and Nurse Chambers found themselves in the midst of this confusion, with escaped patients wandering dangerously close to their vehicle and the night itself seeming to pulse with a barely contained violence that set Loomis's nerves on edge with the dread of terrible recognition. In the midst of this disorder, with rain beginning to fall more heavily and patients moving through the darkness like figures from a nightmare, Michael seized his opportunity with the patience and calculation that would become his signature. He approached the station wagon driven by Dr. Loomis and climbed silently onto its roof after the psychiatrist had stepped out to investigate the situation at the open gate, attempting to understand what had happened and whether his patient was among the escaped inmates. This opportunistic move arose from a momentary vulnerability in what should have been a carefully controlled transport plan, demonstrating an awareness and cunning that Michael had kept hidden throughout his years of apparent catatonia. From his position atop the vehicle, Michael launched his attack, overwhelming both Dr. Loomis and Nurse Chambers in moments of violent confusion before vanishing into the darkness of Warren County's rural roads. The attack was swift and devastating, leaving the psychiatrist and nurse both injured but alive as Michael disappeared into the rainy night, heading instinctively toward Haddonfield, approximately 150 miles away. While the canon leaves his emerging status ambiguous, Michael became something more than an escaped mental patient in that moment. He transformed into a figure who emerged around Halloween, evoking old folk tales and legends where certain repeating elements signaled impending doom for unwary communities. Consequently, the night transformed into a dark continuation of his actions 15 years prior, as he began seeking out the attire and tools necessary to mirror, at least symbolically, the clown suit, mask, and knife from that fateful 1963 evening. The sanitarium's breach not only freed Michael Myers, but also amplified the community's latent fears, drawing law enforcement into a pursuit that would test the very boundaries of what they understood about human endurance, determination, and malice. Dr. Loomis, despite his injuries, immediately understood the gravity of what had happened and began his own desperate race to reach Haddonfield before his patient could strike, knowing with terrible certainty that Michael's return would bring death to the town that had tried so hard to forget him. By dawn on October 31st, 1978, Michael's escape had set the stage for a renewed cycle of violence directly tied to the Halloween season, where his methodical movements through the landscape evoked the persistence of folklore passed between generations. This evasion stemmed from his ability to blend into the ordinary despite having no documented experience with driving or navigating the complex road system between Warren County and Haddonfield, a feat that puzzled investigators but aligned perfectly with the blank, emotionless core that seemed to guide him with uncanny precision toward his destination. As a direct outcome of his escape and the growing awareness of his trajectory, Haddonfield began to brace for whispers of the boogeyman's return, with Dr. Loomis racing ahead through the Halloween dawn to warn local authorities of the danger that only he seemed to fully grasp. The escape's ripples extended far beyond the immediate chaos at Smith's Grove, embedding Michael deeper into the town's collective memory as a shape that actively defied capture and control, ensuring that any future encounters would carry the accumulated weight and dread from this pivotal night when containment failed and ancient patterns reasserted themselves with terrible inevitability. As Michael Audrey Myers made his way steadily toward Haddonfield after his dramatic escape from Smith's Grove Sanitarium, his path intersected with that of a lone mechanic who was driving a service truck along one of the quiet Illinois roads that connected smaller towns to the larger highway system. The encounter, which occurred in the early morning hours of October 31st, turned immediately fatal when Michael attacked the man with swift brutality, ending his life in order to claim the mechanic's dark blue work coveralls, a one-piece jumpsuit that would become inseparable from Michael's image in the years and decades to follow. The mechanic's body would later be discovered by local authorities, missing the jumpsuit and bearing the clear marks of violence, with scattered tools and roadside debris alerting investigators to the presence of something dangerous moving through their jurisdictions. While the canon leaves Michael's specific motivation somewhat ambiguous, we can observe that attire had played a significant, almost ritualistic role in his actions 15 years earlier when the clown costume had been part of the terrible tableau of that Halloween night. The stolen jumpsuit, stained with the honest marks of manual labor, and featuring the mechanic's name patch over the breast pocket, provided Michael with a blank canvas for his form, allowing him to move through shadows and crowds with a sense of uniformity that blended utility with anonymity. As a direct result of this killing, the mechanic's death marked the first casualty in Michael's renewed journey, leaving physical evidence that would later help authorities piece together the trail of disruption leading inexorably back to his hometown. With his basic attire secured, Michael turned his attention to other preparations, moving with the methodical patience that characterized all his actions, never hurrying, never showing visible signs of emotion or urgency, simply progressing step by measured step toward whatever internal goal drove him forward through the autumn landscape. Michael's next destination was the Haddonfield Cemetery, a sprawling ground of weathered stones and ancient trees where generations of the town's residents lay beneath carefully tended grass and seasonal flowers. Under the cover of gathering dusk on Halloween afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon and casting long shadows between the grave markers, Michael located his sister Judith Myers's burial plot. Her headstone was a modest granite slab etched with her name and the dates that marked her brief life. Born in 1948, died on Halloween night in 1963 at just 15 years old. Michael approached the grave with that same unhurried deliberation, then physically removed the tombstone itself, a heavy granite marker that would have required considerable strength to extract from its setting in the earth. He carried this weighty object away from the cemetery, transporting it for later use in the scenes that would unfold across Haddonfield as darkness fell completely. While the film canon leaves the specific reason for this act ambiguous, we can observe that Judith's death had set everything in motion, transforming an ordinary family evening into an irreversible catastrophe that had defined every moment of Michael's existence since that night 15 years ago. The theft of the tombstone disturbed the cemetery's solemn quiet, leaving an empty plot and displaced earth that would puzzle the cemetery's caretakers when they discovered it the following morning. Consequently, the missing marker became a tangible link connecting Michael's past actions to his present intentions, an object carried forward through time to infuse his impending violence with a ritualistic weight that reminded anyone who discovered it of the unresolved echoes from that long ago October night. The cemetery, a place meant for final rest and peaceful remembrance, had been violated by his presence, transformed into another staging ground for the systematic recreation of Halloween horror. Upon reaching the heart of Haddonfield proper, where decorated houses lined familiar streets and jack-o'-lanterns glowed from porches in anticipation of the evening's trick-or-treating, Michael broke into Nichols' hardware store, a modest general store that stocked everything from gardening tools to seasonal decorations. The store's windows displayed Halloween merchandise prominently, and Michael moved through the darkened interior after shattering a rear window to gain entry, selecting the final pieces of his ensemble with careful deliberation. He chose a pale Halloween mask, a mass-produced item molded from a modified Captain Kirk mask from Star Trek, its features smoothed and painted white to create an expression of complete emotional blankness. The mask would become perhaps the most iconic element of Michael Myers' appearance, its vacant eye holes and slack expression creating a face that was simultaneously human and utterly inhuman, familiar yet completely alien. Along with the mask, he gathered coils of rope and a large kitchen knife that gleamed under the faint interior light filtering through the store's windows, its blade sharp and substantial, suitable for the purpose he intended. This intrusion flowed directly from his methodical preparation, ensuring that all necessary items were secured to serve the night's dark purpose, much like the kitchen knife he had wielded as a 6-year-old child in his family home. The hardware store's shattered window and rifled shelves stood as silent evidence of his passage through the town, alerting local business owners to an intruder moving through Haddonfield amid the Halloween preparations, though no one yet connected this break-in to the escaped patient that Dr. Loomis was frantically trying to warn them about. Afterward, Michael retreated to his abandoned childhood home on Lampkin Lane, a decaying structure that had stood empty since his family's dissolution following the events of 1963. The house had fallen into severe disrepair over the 15 years of vacancy, with peeling paint, boarded windows, overgrown weeds choking the yard, and an overall atmosphere of abandonment that had transformed it into one of those neighborhood haunted houses that children whispered about and dared each other to approach. Inside, amid the dust and memories, Michael found minimal sustenance in the form of a stray dog that had wandered too close to the property, providing him with grim nourishment born of pure necessity in his isolated state. This temporary refuge in his childhood home connected Michael physically to the site of his original transgression, closing a circle that had remained open for 15 years and preparing him mentally and physically for the encounters that would soon unfold across Haddonfield's familiar streets. The house on Lampkin Lane, once a symbol of ordinary suburban family life, had been transformed by time and tragedy into something else entirely. A monument to violence past, and a staging ground for violence yet to come. As October 31st, 1978, progressed inexorably toward nightfall. As Michael Audrey Myers settled back into the familiar environment of Haddonfield after his escape and his hours of methodical preparation, his path intersected with that of Laurie Strode, a 17-year-old high school student who was the daughter of a local realtor handling properties throughout the area. On the morning of October 31st, Laurie approached the abandoned Myers house on Lampkin Lane as part of a simple errand, carrying a key that her father had asked her to place under the front doormat in preparation for a potential showing of the long vacant property. The house loomed before her, its weathered facade and overgrown yard marking it clearly as one of Haddonfield's forgotten places, the kind of house that accumulates local legends and becomes part of neighborhood folklore. Lori walked up the cracked sidewalk, climbed the sagging porch steps, and bent to slip the key under the worn doormat, completing her task quickly in the crisp autumn morning air. This brief errand, lasting no more than a minute or two, drew Michael's hidden gaze from within the shadowed interior where he had been waiting and observing. He watched her movements without revealing himself, his presence completely concealed behind boarded windows and in darkened doorways, marking this moment as the beginning of his fixation on Lori as a central figure in the night's unfolding events. While the film canon leaves the precise cause of this attention thoroughly ambiguous, never providing a clear explanation for why Lori specifically became his focus, the encounter pulled him toward what could be interpreted as a recreation of the isolation and intrusion that had defined his actions 15 years earlier, when his sister Judith had been his target. Consequently, Lori departed from the Myers house completely unaware of the presence lurking just beyond her field of vision, but the encounter had planted the seeds of a prolonged pursuit that would transform an ordinary teenage day into a nightmare of escalating terror. What should have been a forgettable moment, dropping off a key for her father's real estate business, had instead become the opening movement of a dark symphony that would play out over the next 12 hours as Michael began shadowing her movements through Haddonfield with patient, methodical attention throughout the afternoon of October 31st, 1978. As Haddonfield hummed with the subtle energy of Halloween preparations, Michael maintained a distant but constant surveillance over Lori as she navigated her normal teenage routines in the small town. He positioned himself at the edges of her world, always watching, never approaching, creating a web of observation that tightened incrementally as the hours passed. Behind hedges near Haddonfield High School, he stood motionless as students poured out of the building at the end of the school day, his white mask just visible between the leaves to anyone who might have looked carefully in his direction. He appeared across the street from her home later in the afternoon, standing perfectly still beside a row of bushes while Lori paused at her bedroom window, visible as a silhouette against the warm interior light. Along the routes, she walked with her friends Annie Brackett and Linda Vanderklok, discussing their evening plans and gossiping about boys and school social dynamics. Michael materialized at intervals, sometimes behind them at a distance, sometimes waiting ahead on the path, his blank mask rendering him almost like a mannequin or a peculiar Halloween decoration rather than a living thread. While the canon leaves his specific motivations thoroughly ambiguous, this extended period of observation had preceded his violence in 1963, suggesting a pattern where Michael built psychological tension without haste, allowing his presence to seep into his victim's awareness gradually before any direct action occurred. As a result, Lori's day unfolded under an unseen weight that she couldn't quite name. A growing sense of unease that manifested as glimpses of a figure in a white mask that seemed to appear and disappear with unsettling regularity, though her friends dismissed her concerns as imagination or Halloween-induced jumpiness. The quiet persistence of Michael's gaze went largely undetected by other passersby who were too absorbed in their own activities to notice the still figure watching from the periphery. This surveillance wove him deeper into the fabric of the community's unassuming rhythm, where costumes and decorations created visual noise that helped him blend into the landscape. His patient observation demonstrated a capacity for delayed gratification and strategic planning that seemed almost incompatible with his history of sudden explosive violence. Yet both qualities coexisted within whatever drove Michael forward through the autumn afternoon. By early evening, as the sun began its final descent and the street lamps of Haddonfield flickered to life one by one, Michael's focus sharpened further as Lori arrived at the Doyle house, a modest two-story residence on a quiet tree-lined street, where she had agreed to babysit young Tommy Doyle for the evening. He lingered in the vicinity as she entered the home and began her evening routine with the child, his form blending with the gathering twilight and the lengthening shadows cast by the neighborhood's mature oak and maple trees. Across the street, Lori's friend Annie Brackett settled into her own babysitting assignment at the Wallace house, where she was responsible for young Lindsay Wallace while the girl's parents attended a Halloween party. The proximity of these two locations was not coincidental in Michael's calculus. While the canon leaves his specific motivations unspoken, the fact that both young women were engaged in babysitting created echoes of family, domesticity, and the kind of ordinary suburban evening that had existed in the Myers household before everything changed on Halloween 1963. Their physical separation, with Laurie in one house and Annie in another despite being visible to each other through windows when the interior lights were on, drew Michael specifically toward Annie as his first target in the night's sequence of violence. Consequently, the Doyle and Wallace homes became unwitting stages for horror, their warm interiors filled with the mundane sounds of children playing and teenage babysitters talking on telephones, all of it contrasting starkly with the cold presence circling outside in the darkness. The transition from observation to action marked a subtle but crucial escalation in Michael's Halloween night, pulling all the carefully laid threads tighter as the moment of violence approached. As evening deepened across Haddonfield on October 31st, 1978, with the last rays of sunset fading to purple and full darkness settling over the residential streets, Michael Auratribe Continuedre Myers shifted from passive observation to active engagement with his chosen victims. His attention turned specifically to Annie Brackett, Laurie's closest friend, who was babysitting Lindsay Wallace at the Wallace house, a cozy suburban home with a detached garage and a backyard that bordered on a small wooded area. Annie, a vibrant and somewhat rebellious teenager, was making plans to sneak away from her babysitting duties to meet her boyfriend Paul, a decision that would prove fatal. Concealed in the shadows of the Wallace family's garage, Michael slipped unnoticed into the backseat of Annie's car while she was inside the house, positioning himself on the floor behind the front seats where the darkness was absolute and his presence completely undetectable to anyone entering the vehicle. This patient waiting demonstrated the calculated nature of his approach. Rather than attacking immediately or impulsively, he positioned himself for maximum impact at the moment of greatest vulnerability. While the canon leaves his specific motivations ambiguous throughout this sequence, we can observe that he consistently targeted individuals in isolated moments, a pattern that aligned with the circumstances surrounding his sister Judith's death 15 years earlier, when she had been alone and vulnerable in her bedroom. When Annie finally slid into the driver's seat of her car, adjusting the rearview mirror and turning the key in the ignition while thinking about the evening ahead with Paul, she had no awareness that death waited just behind her seat. As the engine turned over and the car's interior lights faded, Michael emerged from his hiding place with terrible swiftness, his hands wrapping around Annie's neck in a deliberate strangling hold that cut off her startled cry before it could fully form. The struggle was brief and desperate, confined to the cramped space of the car's interior, with Annie's hands clawing frantically at his grip, while the garage's dim light cast everything in shades of shadow. Before she could escape or alert anyone to her situation, Michael produced the kitchen knife he had taken from Nichols Hardware earlier that day, and with a swift motion he slashed her throat, the wound deep and immediately fatal. The garage fell silent except for the car's idling engine and the settling of Annie's body as it slumped forward against the steering wheel. Her evening plans permanently canceled. Her life ended in the space of a few terrible seconds. As a consequence of this first killing, Annie's body provided Michael with a macabre foundation for the increasingly elaborate staging he would create as the night progressed, leaving the house temporarily vulnerable and drawing him deeper into the structure where more of Laurie's friends would soon arrive. The house itself seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath, with young Lindsay Wallace upstairs watching television, completely unaware that her babysitter had just been murdered mere yards away. Michael moved from the garage into the main house through the connecting door, beginning his infiltration of the domestic space with the same patient deliberation that characterized all his actions, never rushing, always methodical, as though following a script that only he could read. Inside the Wallace house, Michael's presence went undetected as Annie's friends Bob Sims and Linda Vanderklok arrived to take advantage of what they believed was an empty house. having made plans earlier to use the space for their own private romantic encounter while Annie was ostensibly busy babysitting. The couple, wrapped up in their own teenage world of physical attraction and the thrill of stolen privacy, had no awareness that they had just entered a space that Michael had already claimed as his hunting ground for the evening. After Bob and Linda retreated upstairs to one of the bedrooms, closing the door behind them and losing themselves in intimate contact, Michael followed with that same measured, unhurried pace, his footsteps silent on the carpeted stairs despite his substantial frame. While the canon leaves his motivations thoroughly ambiguous, he seemed drawn to pursue those engaged in moments of vulnerability and isolation, transforming what should have been casual visits and teenage romance into fatal interruptions that demonstrated his complete lack of empathy or hesitation. Michael first encountered Bob in the kitchen when the young man came downstairs to retrieve beers from the refrigerator, whistling softly and completely relaxed, thinking himself alone in the house except for Linda waiting upstairs. The attack came without warning. Michael seized Bob with overwhelming strength, lifting him completely off the ground and driving the kitchen knife through his chest with such force that the blade penetrated entirely through his body. But Michael didn't let him fall. Instead, he walked Bob backward toward the wall, pinning him in place with the knife so that his body remained suspended several inches above the floor, held up entirely by the blade embedded in his back through the wall, creating a grotesque display that transformed Bob into a piece of installation art in the suburban kitchen. Moments later, as Linda called out from the bedroom upstairs, wondering what was taking Bob so long and why he hadn't returned with the beers, Michael made his way back up the stairs toward her voice. He employed a brief deception, draping himself in a white sheet like a cheap ghost costume and placing Bob's glasses on top of the sheet to create a crude disguise. Linda, seeing this figure enter the bedroom, initially laughed and made joking comments, believing it to be Bob playing around, completely failing to recognize the danger until it was far too late to escape or defend herself. Michael discarded the sheet pretense within moments, revealing his true form in the blank white mask as he advanced on Linda where she lay on the bed. Before she could fully process what was happening or attempt to flee, he seized the telephone cord from the bedside table and wrapped it tightly around her neck, using it as a garrote to strangle the life from her while she struggled desperately against his unyielding grip. The killing was efficient and methodical, carried out with the same emotionless precision that had characterized his attack on Annie and Bob, leaving the upstairs of the Wallace house bathed in an eerie quiet broken only by the distant sound of the television still playing in the room where Lindsay Wallace remained absorbed in her program, blessedly unaware. The efficiency of these three murders left Michael in complete control of the Wallace house, with the bodies of Annie, Bob, and Linda now available for the staging that would follow. As a consequence, the death toll of the evening had escalated rapidly, pulling Laurie Strode closer to the center of the unfolding horror with each life taken from her immediate circle of friends. The silence that settled over the house was profound and terrible, a stillness that spoke of interrupted lives and futures that would never unfold, all orchestrated by the figure in the white mask who moved through the suburban home like death itself, given physical form and terrible purpose. With three teenagers now dead by his hand, Michael Audrey Myers turned his attention to orchestrating an elaborate tableau in the upstairs bedroom of the Wallace house, creating a scene designed to maximize psychological horror when discovered. He positioned Annie Brackett's body on the bed, arranging her carefully beneath Judith Myers' stolen tombstone, the heavy granite marker that he had removed from the cemetery earlier that day. The tombstone served as a grim centerpiece to the display, its engraved name and dates creating an unmistakable link between past violence and present horror, between the sister he had killed 15 years ago and the young women he was killing now. Next, Michael took Linda's body and forced it into the narrow confines of a bedroom cupboard, folding her form with disturbing precision into the confined space, her limbs positioned in ways that defied comfortable human arrangement. The cupboard door closed on her remains, hiding them from immediate view, but ensuring they would be discovered eventually by anyone opening it. For Bob, Michael employed the coil of rope he had stolen from Nichols' hardware earlier in the day, using it to hang the young man's body inside the bedroom closet so that it would swing forward when the door was opened, creating a horrifying surprise for whoever might look inside. While the film canon leaves Michael's specific motivations for these arrangements thoroughly ambiguous, the careful staging transformed the bedroom into something between a crime scene and a deliberate artistic statement, blending the memory of Judith's murder with fresh violence in ways that suggested ritual significance even if the exact meaning remained obscure. The arrangement turned the room into a space that existed outside normal domestic reality, a chamber of death that waited silently for discovery, with each element placed with calculated precision to create maximum impact. To complete his preparation of the scene, Michael moved methodically through the Wallace house, extinguishing lights one by one throughout the first and second floors. Each switch he flipped plunged another section of the house into darkness, transforming the once warm and inviting home into a structure that appeared abandoned from the outside, its windows dark and its interior hidden from the casual observation of neighbors or passers-by on the street. This deliberate elimination of light heightened the sense of abandonment and danger, creating an atmosphere that would draw the curious or concerned directly into his trap. As a result of this meticulous staging, the silent Wallace house stood as a lure across the street from where Laurie continued babysitting Tommy Doyle, completely unaware of what had transpired so close to her location. When she would eventually notice the unnatural quiet in the darkness of the house where her friends should have been, her natural concern would lead her directly into the path that Michael had prepared with such patient, deliberate intent. The house had been transformed from a space of ordinary suburban life into a carefully constructed stage for horror, waiting in darkness for its next participant to arrive and discover what had been created within its walls. The setup was complete. Every element in place, every light extinguished, every body positioned exactly as Michael intended. The Wallace house stood in its imposed darkness, a structure that now existed outside the normal flow of Halloween evening in Haddonfield, transformed into something else entirely by the methodical violence that had unfolded within its rooms. And across the street, in the warmth and light of the Doyle house, Laurie Strode continued her evening with young Tommy, reading him stories and preparing him for bed, her concern for her friends growing as phone calls went unanswered, and the house across the street remained unnaturally dark and still, drawing her inevitably toward the discovery that would shatter her ordinary world forever.